The current health emergency management policies have been developed on the basis that the World Health Organization's guidelines are sound and work well. However, what if they are incorrect? Let's look at the current policies and technologies being implemented by governments around the world.
Today suggests, that vaccinated people do not carry the virus, don't get sick, and that it's not just in the clinical trials, but it's also in real-world data.
Reports from our international colleagues, including Israel, suggest increased risk of severe disease amongst those vaccinated early. Given this body of evidence, we are concerned that the current strong protection against severe infection, hospitalization, and death could decrease in the months ahead, especially among those who are at higher risk or who were vaccinated earlier during the phases of our vaccination rollout.
PCR tests. These are used for diagnosing the case numbers and are not an indication of deaths or hospitalizations from serious illnesses due to SARS-CoV-2.
Dr. Kary Mullis was awarded the Nobel Prize for his invention of the polymerase chain reaction, the PCR. The PCR is a method of analysis and wasn't designed to test for a virus. Mullis explains why.
And with PCR, if you do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the sort of Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else, right? I mean, because if you can amplify one single molecule up to something that you can really measure, which PCR can do, then there's just very few molecules that you don't have at least one single one of them in your body, okay? So that could be thought of as a misuse of it, just to claim that it's meaningful.
The PCR test can potentially find anything you are looking for, depending on how high you turn it up. And this is exactly what has been done. The official protocol given for the PCR testing of COVID-19 created a floodgate of false positives to skew the results. They call it asymptomatic because it's a lie. These people don't have symptoms because they don't have COVID-19. They do it today because they've done it in the past and always gotten away with it. 30 years ago, Anthony Fauci, head of the NIH, made a name for himself by pushing for higher doses of the deadly drug AZT, an old cancer chemotherapy too dangerous for approval, onto AIDS patients. Kary Mullis was hired to measure HIV in people's blood samples with his PCR. He was working under the premise that HIV was the probable cause of AIDS. But when he went looking for the proof, he found there was none. They just made it up.
What is that paper? Who do I go to for that? And I looked around, I asked a couple of virologists at that company, and they said, no, you don't have to reference. I said, I have to reference that because I don't know where that came from. How do I know that? And it turned out that nobody knew it. And I was getting really freaked about that. That's when I first started saying, they don't know. Nobody really knows. This whole thing is a big sham.
Mullis pointed out how the CDC was losing money and how the HIV-AIDS connection brought their profits back in the black, and how the men at the highest levels were all in on it. Kary Mullis knew these men were dangerous.
They don't want people like me walking up and asking them those kind of questions, and they're willing to go to great lengths to prevent that. They're out on a limb. I wouldn't want to be there with them.
But he was still outspoken. When ABC's Nightline approached him about doing a documentary on his work, Mullis convinced them to cover the HIV debate after nearly a decade of ignoring it. In a 1994 interview with Celia Farber for Spin magazine, Kary Mullis expressed how he really wanted to expose Anthony Fauci and Robert Gallo. He said that he'd be willing to chase the little bastard from his car to his office, a Nobel Prize winner trying to ask a simple question from those who spent $22 billion and killed 100,000 people. It has to be on TV. I'm not unwilling to do something like that. Unfortunately, not many people were listening back then. And on August 7th, 2019, just about 3 months before the first utterance of COVID-19, Kary Mullis, age 74, a Nobel Prize winner, inventor of the PCR test, a man who was once willing and eager to expose Anthony Fauci, quietly died of pneumonia.
My name is Dr. Michael Yeadon. My original training
was a first-class honours degree in biochemistry and toxicology, followed by a research-based PhD into respiratory pharmacology. And after that, I've worked my entire life on the research side of the pharmaceutical industry, both big pharma and also biotech. My specific focus has been inflammation, immunology, allergy, in the context of respiratory diseases, so the lung, but also the skin. A test called a PCR test is performed on that, and what they're looking for isn't the virus. You might think it's looking for the virus, but it's not. What they're looking for is a small piece of genetic sequence. It's called RNA. Unfortunately, that bit of RNA will be found in people's tonsils and nose, not if they've just caught the virus and they're about to get ill or they're already ill. It's also going to be found if they were infected previously, weeks or even sometimes a small number of months ago. Let me just explain why that is. If you've been infected and you've fought off the virus, which most people do, you'll have broken, dead bits of virus. These are tiny things, smaller than your cells, perhaps spread all the way through your airway, embedded in bits of mucus, maybe inside an airway lining cell. And so over a period of weeks or months, you bring up cells that contain broken, dead pieces of the virus that you have conquered and killed. However, the PCR test is not able to detect whether the viral RNA has come from a living virus or a dead one, as I've just described. So I think a large proportion of the so-called positives are in fact what I call cold positives. They're correctly identifying that there is some viral RNA in the sample, but it's from a dead virus. It can't hurt them. They're not going to get ill. They can't transmit it to anybody else.
And one of the things that we forget is that 45% of our human DNA, which is called our microbiome, is made up of viruses that live inactive and dormant in our body. That's part of our immune system. And so if you've ever been exposed to a coronavirus in the past, whether it's a cold, a flu, a respiratory infection, that can show up on a PCR test if you blow it up above a certain amplification. I don't know if you remember last summer where there were laboratory tests that were done in labs in Florida and in Georgia, and they were showing 100%, literally 100% of their tests were coming through were positive for the SARS-CoV-2 test.
There are dozens of labs that process tests. On the state's website, we found numerous labs that are only reporting positive test results. So they show a 100% positivity rate.
That means every single person tested was positive. We sifted through the reports to find local testing sites with high numbers. Like this Centricare, 83 people tested and all positive. Check out the Orlando VA, a positivity rate of 76%. NCF Diagnostics has a location in Alachua, 88% of tests coming back positive, and 98% for Orlando Health. Of course, it makes you wonder if these numbers are wrong, are other numbers on the report also wrong?
The only reason why that was is because they were testing at 40 amplification and above. And if you look at the big laboratories in the United States and across the globe, and I know because I've spoken to almost all of them, the PCR testing is done at 37 to 45 amplifications, which is going to cause a 97% false positive or more. That's why you're seeing all these people that have positive tests, but yet have no symptomatology. And remember, you can be diagnosed with SARS-CoV-2, but not develop COVID-19, which is the disease caused by SARS-CoV-2, because if you're asymptomatic, you don't have the disease by definition of the CDC.
Now, in his own words, the PCR test should never be used to diagnose disease. Let me repeat that. The man who created the PCR test said this test should never be used to diagnose disease. It is simply a tool to find if there's even a fragment of an illness inside of somebody. It came about when they were looking for AIDS, and very difficult to find viruses that you wouldn't, as he said, you can't always, he made fun of Tony Fauci. Kerry Mullis did not like Tony Fauci, thought he was completely uneducated for the job, wasn't a scientist, was basically just a pencil pusher, a bureaucrat that controlled scientists. And Kerry Mullis had a serious problem with Tony Fauci.
Guys like Fauci get up there and start talking, he doesn't know anything really about anything. And I'd say that to his face. Nothing.
The man thinks you can take a blood sample and stick it in an electron microscope, and if it's got a virus in there, you'll know it. He doesn't understand electron microscopy, and he doesn't understand medicine, and he should not be in a position like he's in. Most of those guys up there on the top are just total administrative people, and they don't know anything about what's going on at the bottom. You know, those guys have got an agenda, which is not what we would like them to have, being that we pay for them to take care of our health in some way. They've got a personal kind of agenda. They make up their own rules as they go. They change them when they want to, and they smugly, like Tony Fauci, does not mind going on television in front of the people that pay his salary and lie directly into the camera. You can't expect the sheep to really respect the best and the brightest. They don't know the difference, really. I mean, I like humans, don't get me wrong, but basically the vast majority of them do not possess the ability to judge who is and who isn't a really good scientist. I mean, that's a problem. That's a main problem, actually, with science, I'd say, in this century, because science is being judged by people. Funding is being done by people who don't understand it. Okay, who do we trust? Fauci? Fauci doesn't know enough to, you know. If Fauci wants to get on television with somebody who knows a little bit about this stuff and debate him, he could easily do it because he's been asked.
In any case, as I've previously discussed in this video, for some reason the FDA and other health authorities have failed to collect any significant data on PCR cycle thresholds, despite Dr. Fauci saying it was an important value for the clinician to consider. Check out that video for more about cycle thresholds. With regards to SARS-CoV-2, there is an additional issue in that the target genetic material is for a presumed RNA virus. This means that before starting the actual PCR process, the target RNA must be converted to complementary DNA with the enzyme reverse transcriptase. Professor of Molecular Medicine Stephen A. Buston pointed to the problem that in the course of this conversion process, the amount of DNA obtained with the same RNA-based material can vary widely, even by a factor of 10. So this initial step can also cause variation in whether the subsequent PCR test is considered positive or not. Interestingly, Buston, who helped develop the MIQE guidelines to standardize PCR protocols, had the following to say about COVID-19 PCR tests. We demonstrate that elementary protocol errors, inappropriate data analysis, and inadequate reporting continue to be rife, and conclude that the majority of published RT-qPCR data are likely to represent technical noise.
One of the first times I saw it challenged was a press briefing, and somebody in the audience, a journalist who actually seemed to have some curiosity, said something to the effect of,
can you talk about your concerns about deaths being misreported?
So I think in this country, we've taken a very liberal approach to mortality. There are other countries that if you had a pre-existing condition, and let's say the virus caused you to go to the ICU and then have a heart or kidney problem, some countries are recording that as a heart issue or a kidney issue and not a COVID-19 death. Right now, we're still recording it, and the great thing about having forms that come in and a form that has the ability to mark it as COVID-19 infection, the intent is right now that if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? I mean, you hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews the data that you're trying to collect in terms of projections and things like that?
I think there's so much focus now on coronavirus. I can't imagine if someone comes in with coronavirus, goes to an ICU, and they have an underlying heart condition and they die, they're going to say cause of death, heart attack. I cannot see that happening, so I don't think it's going to be a problem.
And sure enough, what happened is we saw many, many situations in which that occurred. And sometimes they became public because family members would challenge the death. There was one in Florida, for example, where a nurse died, and it was during the height of the pandemic. And so, of course, the party line was that, of course, she died of COVID, but later her family became furious. Apparently she had kidney disease or something, and that's what killed her. And they absolutely insisted on setting the record straight. Another one, and this, I try to insert some humor in this once in a while so you just don't go crazy, but in Washington State, it turned out that there were a lot of inflated deaths, and one journalist asked Governor Inslee if deaths were inflated, and he said, oh no, that's nothing but a conspiracy theory from the planet of Pluto. I'm not kidding, that's what he said.
The problem is you got some people out there who are fanning these conspiracy claims from the planet Pluto. And it's just disgusting what they're trying to say of all these crazy deep state malarkey.
Well, later on, when the records were made public, it was not a conspiracy theory from the planet of Pluto, actually. There were inflated deaths. They were even taking gunshot wounds and categorizing them as COVID deaths.
It's the first time Coroner Brenda Bach has felt so frustrated by a cause of death.
These two people had tested positive for COVID, but that's not what killed them. The gunshot wound is what killed them.
We had a case in January here where we had someone die. The cause of death was due to an accidental drug overdose. The decedent had tested positive for COVID. As soon as that death came across to the state, they went ahead and classified it and put a statistic as a COVID death.
To the family, their dad died from advanced cancer. In fact, Avamere considered Fred recovered from COVID. But a few days after his death, Lincoln County Public Health reported him as their 9th COVID death. They now have 10 deaths.
I mean, that's not what he died from. He died from colon cancer, not the COVID. And places are listing loved ones as COVID deaths, and they're labeling that, and it's just not true.
So if a person died in a car accident from alcohol poisoning or a gunshot wound and had COVID, would that be considered a COVID death? Well, according to the OHA, the short answer, yes.
I could give lots of examples like that, but the strange and unusual way in which the deaths were determined on the death certificates definitely inflated deaths. And the difference between dying from and with a COVID, we'll probably spend the rest of our days figuring out which was which.
The case definition is very simplistic. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID positive diagnosis. So that means that if you were in hospice and had already been given, a few weeks to live, and then you also were found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means technically, even if you died of a clear alternate cause, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. So everyone who's listed as a COVID death doesn't mean that that was the cause of the death, but they had COVID at the time of death.
The determination of the cause of death is a big deal. It has impact on estate planning. It has impact on future generations. And the idea that we're going to allow people to massage and sort of game the numbers is a real issue, because we're going to undermine the trust.
mRNA technology for vaccines. Virologist and inventor of mRNA gene therapy technology said this about these vaccines.
One thing clearer, you said it very clearly, but lots of people who aren't familiar with this aren't going to get it. Okay, so the RNA gets into the cell. It is translated by the ribosome into a protein. In this case, it's the spike protein, which is the best target on the coronavirus.
We could debate that, but go ahead.
But it's at least a very good one. It's a prominent
good target.
And
nobody argues with that.
If the antibodies grab onto it, the most likely thing to happen is that they will block it from doing what it does that facilitates the entry into the cell. So if everything works the way the brochure says, it's a good target.
After about 5 days, though, the antibodies have to be...
So the whole reason to use an adenoviral vector or an mRNA is not just to generate antibodies. And a lot of the data, and a lot of us that are deep in this data, think that the way that they're really providing the protection is by cellular cytotoxicity. So you're getting CTLs against it. And that's the reason to use this gene therapy-based technology, is not just to generate neutralizing antibodies, but to generate cytotoxic T lymphocytes.
Okay, you and I are about to go down the rabbit hole because this is biologically fascinating, which I want to avoid doing. But you just said the reason to use the adenovirus vector which is with the DNA vaccines, not the RNA vaccines, which is what we were talking about.
I would call it. It's not a DNA vaccine. It's an advector vaccine.
Right. It is the use of a
recombinant virus, which happens to be a DNA virus.
Yeah.
But it's the same basic idea. It's gene therapy technology applied to vaccines.
Okay. It's the same technology, and everything downstream of the translation of the spike protein is the same.
Spike protein?
Yeah.
Is the same. And by the way, we have no problems at all with mRNA vaccines.
Right.
It's just this particular vaccine, because of the spike protein and because it cleaves off the cell and it goes throughout your body and your brain, your heart, and anywhere, that you can have these symptoms that are so varied, whether it's a 16-year-old who can't talk or see 48 hours after injection, or someone whose handshakes, or someone who's my carpet cleaner, Tim. He's like disabled now. He's lost $30,000 in terms of his costs, and he's going in for an epidural because he's in such pain. And so these side effects, the victims of this vaccine, they're not being able to tell their story at the press because Tim says I try to tell my story and the press ignores him, and we have these groups that aren't able to get attention.
Aren't able to get attention. A large group of people who believe that they have suffered negative consequences was removed from Facebook. So there's very clearly an effort
to 200,000 users just wiped off the planet. Right. Now, if this is a perfectly safe vaccine.
So the censoring has been going on for well over a year. It's well documented. It's unequivocal. And my argument is that by implementing censoring, what we're doing is making it so that signals can't be detected.
Yeah.
People's voices can't be heard. And I'm of the opinion that we have to have free and open discussion, and we have to have full disclosure of risks.
As for the integrity and ethics of the pharmaceutical companies who develop these vaccines, Pfizer set a record for the largest healthcare fraud settlement and the largest criminal fine of any kind with $2.3 billion in 2009. Nearly 10,000 women filed prempro breast cancer lawsuits against Pfizer. By 2012, Pfizer settled most of the claims for more than $1 billion. In 1996, Pfizer conducted an unapproved clinical trial. It involved children with meningitis in Nigeria, CBS News reported. The trials led to the deaths of 11 children. Dozens more were left disabled. By 2012, Pfizer settled most of the claims for more than $1 billion.
The US-based company Pfizer is holding governments to ransom, interfering with their legislation, even demanding military bases as guarantee. Would you believe it? A vaccine maker asking for a country's military base in return for vaccines.
Moderna also made media headlines with ex-employees speaking out about them. Janssen, who developed the Johnson & Johnson, J&J vaccines, pleaded guilty to America's largest healthcare fraud. Johnson & Johnson, J&J and its subsidiaries paid more than $2.2 billion to resolve criminal and civil liability arising from allegations relating to the prescription drugs Risperdal, Invega and Natacor, including promotion for uses not approved as safe and effective by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA, and payment of kickbacks to physicians and to America's largest long-term care pharmacy provider. J&J has faced hundreds of thousands of lawsuits over claims its products are defective. In 2019, J&J recalled tens of thousands of bottles of its iconic Johnson's baby powder after the FDA found small amounts of asbestos in a sample. But state juries have ordered the company to pay billions of dollars to people who claimed the product gave them cancer. In October 2020, Johnson & Johnson agreed to settle more than 1,000 talcum powder lawsuits for $100 million. J&J paid $33 million to most U.S. states and the District of Columbia. The states charged J&J with misrepresenting the manufacturing practices behind certain drugs. This included its Motrin products. These products were later recalled. While AstraZeneca had to pay $110 million to settle 2 lawsuits brought by the state of Texas claiming that it fraudulently marketed the antipsychotic drug Seroquel and Crestor for high cholesterol. However, out of all of them, none can quite compete with the appalling lack of human welfare considerations that have continually been shown by Pfizer, the company who was first to develop these mRNA vaccines, from the German-owned BioNTech, who just happened to be located at BioLake, in Hubei Province, Wuhan, China. Chief virologist, an ex-employee of Pfizer, has had this to say about the vaccines and the WHO guidelines.
This system is being put in place using lies, and it's being put in place using lies for some purpose, and I believe that purpose is complete totalitarian control. And I think the purpose of that is going to be mass depopulation.
We also have ex-employees who surprisingly have been speaking out opposed to these vaccines.
So what you're saying here is that they kind of picked which time points they looked at after administering the vaccines to make sure that they could show that there were fewer cases. Is that
it's worse?
Kind of
it's worse than that. It's worse than that. At 1 week, they decided to run the PCR test instead of waiting 2 weeks. So if you look at the CDC website, it says you don't produce monoclonal antibodies until 2 weeks after the second dose. Okay, they tested at 1 week because too many people were getting sick in the treatment group. But worse than that, they had more people in the treatment group presenting with COVID-19 symptoms than in the placebo group, but they decided they ran out of time to test the people in the placebo group, or sort of test the people in the treatment group. So they just tested the people in the placebo group and said, hey, look, more people are getting sick in the placebo group. So it's horrible what they did.
Wow. So basically they just omitted the data that would have showed that more people got sick from their vaccine than got sick from any natural cause.
Exactly.
And this is really not surprising to any of us who have been following the devastating side effects, mortality, and serious illness that has occurred in people who have been vaccinated. So essentially what we're saying here is that Pfizer knew about this up front and covered it up in order to make sure that their authorization went through. So how did they regulators at the FDA not pick up on these discrepancies?
They did. They ignored it. I don't understand On October 20th or 22nd of 2020, they had a meeting where they went over all of the serious adverse events that they needed to keep an eye out on for these vaccines prior to authorization. And it included Guillain-Barré, it included inflammation of the brain, inflammation of the spine, it included myocarditis, pericarditis, thrombocytopenia, thrombosis. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. They knew these things were not only harmful, but potentially lethal. And they just ignored the fraudulent and erroneous analysis that was done on the data. They just chose to, turn a blind eye to it. There's an 8-hour recording of this. When they started asking questions about, can we go into more detail about how you measured these outcomes, they just said, nothing to see here, move on to the next page. It's recorded.
Wow. So what do you think could have been what's going on behind the scenes that they're just ignoring this? Are they feeling pressure, or are they, in cahoots with the pharmaceutical industry? I mean, we certainly know there is a revolving door between, various federal regulatory agencies and the industry. But, do you have a kind of theory on why they would just let this slide by and gloss over it the way that they did?
No, I've never seen anything like this in my entire career, and just historical review of any over-the-counter or pharmaceutical or medical device there.
An ex-employee, vaccine maker, and virologist, Geert van den Bosch, has had this to say.
I guess what I am very worried about, and I have been making this call since quite some time, is that mass vaccination will inevitably drive immune escape, will force the virus to escape the immune response that is actually induced by those vaccines. And of course, I will come to this in a moment. I will explain this, but I think the slide that of the publication is just illustrating that basically this has already been documented in the literature for viral diseases, that if you massively, and this was in animals, vaccinate animals with a vaccine that prevents against disease, but not against infection, that this is basically forcing the virus to select mutations that enhance its infectiousness, that the vaccines cannot prevent these highly infectious strains from being shed. But that is not the most interesting scenario for the virus. As I was saying, for the virus, in order to ensure its perpetuation, it is critical that it can make these people ill. Because if you make the people ill, being a virus, you will ensure very strong and a long-lived viral shedding, and that is needed, frankly speaking, for the virus to continue or to ensure its perpetuation. Now, if you prevent this, and to some extent we are still preventing it, just quite recently, as Jean-Pierre showed, that we have now even some strains where we have only like 20-30% of efficacy against disease. But so far, we still had some protection against the disease, and so the virus was not really, doing very much in terms of ensuring its perpetuation in the vaccinated people. So then it has no choice, but it has to stay with the younger people. But there, the reservoir got almost exhausted of people that potentially could get a disease. So what is it going to do? It is going to increase its infectiousness, because when it increases its infectiousness, and I was saying the condition is there because these people are now, with increasing infection rate, increasingly exposed to reinfection with the virus while they're having suboptimal antibody titers, and so the virus can escape. And the virus will increase its infectiousness, and by increasing its infectiousness, I mean, people, will become more susceptible. So their natural antibodies get suppressed. That is during natural infection. But now by increasing its infectiousness, it can make these people much more susceptible. So it will take a bigger part of the younger population just by increasing its infectiousness. And that is what we are seeing right now. The virus has to stay with the younger people, and the wave of disease in the younger people must increase in order for the virus to ensure its perpetuation. And so that is where the vaccination is starting to have dramatic effects, and people say, well, no. And the reaction is, of course, oh, wow, these vaccines protect elderly people. Look, I mean, there is less hospitalization, there's fewer hospitalizations, they don't get severe disease. So what we need to do is to vaccinate the younger people. I mean, this is just going to be a catastrophe, because we see already that the virus is escaping all the time to the antibody responses. So frankly speaking, it's just a matter of days or weeks till we have full resistance. Yes, resistance against those vaccines, also in terms of protecting against disease. And what's happening then is that folks who got vaccinated, they can simply throw their antibodies in the bin, their vaccinal antibodies, but they also they can no longer rely on their innate immunity. Why is this? Well, I told you previously that despite the fact that these antibodies will no longer prevent the virus from interacting with the receptor on the cell, their binding will still be strong enough to the spike protein to outcompete the natural antibodies. So you're left with nothing. If you would not get the vaccine, or you would not have these antibodies, you would still be able to rely on the only ally that is left, which is your innate immunity. And so I think this is really the core of my message, that antigen-specific antibodies, they can be detrimental, especially in people who are in good health. Because people who are in good health, they can rely on their innate immunity, provided they get regularly exposed. Why I'm saying this? Because the innate immunity has no memory. It's like you're sitting on your chair for like 3 weeks. Your muscles are going to wane. I mean, this is the same with the innate immune response. Your innate immunity, if it's not trained, if you don't go out, if you're not exposed, if you lock in young people, etc., their innate immune system will not be trained. But if you're in good health and you train this, you will have a strong innate immunity. What is the advantage? For God's sake, innate immunity protects against all variants, against all coronavirus. So it is incredibly precious. So you cannot put this at stake. It's just impossible. I mean, I can tell you, this is the first time in the history of mankind that we humans are intervening in such a massive way, with massive infection prevention measures, with massive vaccination campaigns, where there is plenty of opportunity, as I try to explain you, for the virus to be facing suboptimal immune responses and to escape. And that is why I'm saying, and I'm scientifically convinced of this, that we are making of a virus that was initially pretty harmless, we are making really a kind of monster of this virus, because the more we chase it, the more it will become infectious. And this is right now already, starts already, to be a disaster. And I'm telling people, who are not listening, scientists, top scientists, health authorities, I'm telling them, well, look at those countries who have their successful mass vaccination campaigns implemented, like the UK, like Israel, like Gibraltar, and very soon also the US. You see the declines, of course, you have an effect, but for sure, after this decline, you will see a huge wave of disease and unfortunately also mortalities, despite the fact that these countries are going to further increase their vaccine coverage. So then, when people will see that despite increased vaccine coverage, 60, 70, 80% of population, all we get is increased rates of mortality and morbidity, then people will probably realize, responsibles will probably realize, oh my gosh, something went wrong here. But what do you think? I mean, if you intervene on a large scale in this pandemic, there is only two possible outcomes. Either you have a fantastic effect, or you generate a disaster. And I'm certainly not a drama queen. I mean, this is based, guys, on science. And so I'm glad that Jean-Pierre started the introduction with the slide where, my goodness, guys, this has already been documented that vaccines that do not protect against infection, that do not prevent the infection, but only the disease, that this is a recipe for immune escape and for breeding variants that have a higher infectiousness.
So what happens to the monoclonal antibody treatments?
Push to the side.
Why?
Money. It's disgusting. You're not wearing a wire, right?
You want to check?
I mean, I still feel like I work for like an evil corporation because it comes down to profits in the end. And I mean, I'm there to help people, not to make millions and millions of dollars. So I mean, that's the moral dilemma.
Billions and billions?
I'm trying to be nice.
WHO ex-employees have also been speaking out about the guidelines and ethics of this establishment.
Dr. Francesco Zambon was tasked with sending a detailed plan to all nations on how to cope, based on Italy's response. He did it, it was published, then it was withdrawn by the World Health Organization. The world never got the plan.
They could have had what we didn't have, time. We didn't have time to prepare, but this report would have allowed them to buy time, which was by far the most important good for getting better prepared for the pandemic.
The chaotic scenes of overwhelmed hospitals in northern Italy prompted the WHO to provide real-time analysis to help governments prepare. Italy was not unique in being unprepared. Most countries were not. The report team discovered that Italy's pandemic plan hadn't changed since 2006 and noted it. Dr. Zambon and his lawyer say it wasn't an issue until WHO officials told the Zambon team to amend the report and say the plan had been updated. He refused and has resigned. Dr. Zambon says the affair has completely undermined the World Health Organization's reputation.
I think that the problem here is about the lack of independence, a lack of transparency of the World Health Organization. The mandate of the organization is to preserve, to promote the health of the citizens of the entire world. And the story that happened in a year shows that the organization is bound by personal interests, by government's interests, and by financial powers.
100 miles or so west of Venice is Bergamo, one of the worst hit cities in the pandemic. Prosecutors are investigating the government's COVID planning on behalf of the families of those who died here. They've asked for the WHO to help their investigation, but so far it has refused, even saying staff members have immunity from questioning. It's left the prosecution teams confused and suspicious and talking to Dr. Zambon.
Il problema per noi è ancora quello di sapere perché c'è stata questa esplosione pandemica qui. Stanno trasformando questa indagine in, non dico un complotto, ma comunque un qualche cosa di politico e anche di livello internazionale che non era nelle nostre intenzioni.
And Dr. Astrid Zuckelberger.
What you're doing is that you are paying for a vaccine that has never been tested, has not scientific data that is valid. It has been contested by many, many scientific people who are extremely specialized in vaccine. It's never been done before. Coronaviruses don't have an efficient vaccine. On top of it, they mutate all the time. So today, there is not the same mutation. And on top of this, they vaccinate you with a vaccine that can make you sick. Because 11% in Israel, under over 100,000 vaccines, are reinfected with a strain that we don't know. The only way to know is to do sequencing of the genome. So it's really a big plan, complicated, but you can see that the financial system, I can also say you one more thing, is that they are, since 2006, IFFIM has leverage of donors, and they have issued vaccines bond on the global capital market, generating more than 6.2 billion through 35 issuance in 8 currencies. So this is, they consider a pioneering social bond and vaccine bonds, and they enjoy this, and they think this is responsible to save lives. But in fact, they are playing the roulette and the casino with the vaccines and with human lives, are dictating a will of not communicating. And it seems, they are not taking the people specialists that I know. They are doing live presentation, very generalizing, changing words, changing definitions, not giving precise data, not giving precise science. And what is it's very shocking, is that all the medias in the world say the same thing, the same words, in the shops, in the airports, in the newspapers, and they are paying the media for producing what they want. It is in the law of COVID-19. So how can you have a debate? And then they just build a task force of experts. The task force in Switzerland is full of conflict of interest. I take one after the other of my colleagues at University of Geneva, in the Tropical Institute of Basel. Professor Tanner, he has been funded by Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation immensely. The University of Geneva also, the University of Lausanne also. So the task force and the scientists that are built to lead this pseudo-pandemic are actually helping the rhetoric of the press. We don't have a debate. We have censorship. Censorship is the first, sign of a dictatorship. Freedom of expression is the liberty that you can see when you are free to talk. And this time, we are in a science fiction, big time. The politicization of a new science, fake science. And it is pretty dramatic because it has consequences on people, people's life, people's economy. People can be saved and they censor doctors, they censor treatments that work.
Let's also look at the origin of this virus, as this is most crucial to the development of safe and effective vaccines. Former CDC Director Robert Redfield also believes that the COVID-19 virus was a gain-of-function lab leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
If I was to guess, this virus started transmitting somewhere in September, October in Wuhan.
September, October.
That's my own view. It's an only opinion. I'm allowed to have opinions now. I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped. Other people don't believe that. That's fine. Science will eventually figure it out. It's not unusual for respiratory pathogens that are being worked on in a laboratory to infect a laboratory worker.
What are some of the scientists saying about this virus? For example, Nobel Prize-winning scientist Dr. Luc Montagnier had this to say about the origin of the virus and about vaccines.
d'horloger, dans quel but des séquences. Mais dans quel but? Dans quel but, ça, ce n'est pas clair. Moi, j'expose, si vous voulez, mon travail, c'est d'exposer les faits, c'est tout.
The expert American cardiologist Dr. Fleming discovered a very curious financial link with Dr. Anthony Fauci and the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
In 2015, remember HKU4? Not infective in humans? In 2015, Zheng Li altered it, intentionally changed 2 mutation sites and caused the virus to be extremely infective. This was not a naturally occurring process. She wrote in the paper that she did it. And wait a minute, it was paid for by NIH grants. In 2017, they lifted the gain-of-function ban. Now, during this time, there were people who were getting gain-of-function research. And Dr. Anthony Fauci was one of the people who helped determine who got funded. During a time when Obama said, no more. In 2018, Xi Zhengli gave a presentation in a Shanghai university in November talking about the studies of coronaviruses and cross-species infection. That university has wiped that presentation from the internet. In 2019, the Wuhan Institute of Virology database wiped months before the outbreak. And by the end of the year, the Wuhan Municipal Health Commission report warning of a new pneumonia wiped. In fact, I will tell you that not only did they take the backbone of one virus and attach it to the spike protein of another virus, but the research data, if you dig far enough into it, finds that they inserted 5 specific nucleotides in sequence. One of those was into the envelope of this virus, which is critical for infecting the brain. The next couple of slides, there's a ton of material. Remember, you can download this from the internet. The emphasis of this is to point out that the federal monies that went to Peter Daszak, who then paid Barrick and Zheng Li, it's not just one, it's not just 2, and it's not just over a couple years, it's over 2 decades. If you look at the material, and you can do this on your own, you'll see the years, the monies in the departments. The Department of Defense, Health and Human Services, the National Science Foundation, the U.S. Agency for International Development, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Commerce, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of the Interior. Not one grant, not just a little money, not just a couple years, decades, and over $61 million, more than half of which was by the Department of Defense, who not only provided money, but provided a military advisor, David France, who was former deputy commander of Fort Detrick. And for those of you who don't recognize Fort Detrick, it was a biological weapons facility. PRRA insert is in the stable part of the spike protein. And we know that. Oops, I did a little bit better for you. There's the sequence. The furin cleavage site is right down here. Remember I said 12 nucleotides? There they are that make these 4 amino acids. Okay? And if we go over here, these are all the known coronaviruses. And you've heard about pangolin and all the others. They're listed up here. Only SARS-CoV-2 has this PRRA. This is the genetic number, the nucleotide number, so we know exactly where that insert is. They did a great job at designing this, but when you have science on your side, you can find where these things are and find the exact numbers and compare them. That's what Montagnier did for the HIV stuff. He also showed the PRRA, and the rest of the spike protein is, you know, everybody sequences out. We know it's there. It's critical, and this paper shows it's critical. PRA is essential to infecting human cells. It's the furin cleavage site, and guess who owns the patent for the insertion of the enzymes related to the furin cleavage site? That's the insertion of it. Oh, it's us, NIH, the US government, and it owns it because it paid for it. And what's it useful for? It's useful for HIV to glycoprotein 120 and tumor progression, because this virus also shuts down the P53 system, which we're not going to really talk about, except the P53 system protects you from cancer, and this virus helps shut it down.
Here's the science about vaccines.
Je suis scandalisé par le fait qu'on veut aussi vacciner des enfants. Parce que là, on touche vraiment aux générations futures. Il faut savoir que, par exemple, pour le glyphosate, n'est-ce pas, des travaux récents montrent que il y a des effets épigénétiques, c'est-à-dire les gens qui mangent du glyphosate dans leur alimentation, ils transmettent quelque chose qui va se produire dans les générations futures. Les fils, les petits-fils, les arrière-petits-fils vont souffrir. Bon, ceci a été montré chez des rats pour l'instant, mais on peut extrapoler à l'homme. Donc, il y a des effets épigénétiques, il faut penser à ça, c'est-à-dire il faut pas seulement penser à ses propres générations, mais au futur. Et donc là, le messager, l'ARN messager que vous injectez de votre vaccin peut très bien avoir des effets aussi pour les générations futures qu'on ne détecte pas si on ne les cherche pas.
Donc là, c'est la persistance, on va dire, de ces substances qu'on injecte sans vraiment connaître les conséquences à moyen terme et à long terme.
Absolument. Là, on nage dans l'inconnu total et essayer de proclamer la vaccination obligatoire pour tous, c'est une folie. C'est une folie vaccinatoire contre laquelle je m'élève absolument. Et je ne dis pas bien sûr que, et ce que j'ai jamais dit, et je ne prédis pas que tout le monde va mourir du vaccin, mais un certain nombre de personnes vont souffrir du vaccin. Et ça, c'est pas admissible.
Donc, ils vont souffrir au travers d'effets secondaires qu'on n'a pas encore observés, qu'on n'a pas encore mesurés dans les études parce qu'on n'a pas assez de recul.
Exactement. Il y a des effets à pas plusieurs générations peut-être aussi, mais il y a des effets sur la même génération au bout de 5 ans, au bout de 10 ans. C'est tout à fait possible, notamment pour ce qu'on appelle les maladies neurodégénératives. Alors, il y a des séquences qui ressemblent à des séquences de prions dans l'ARN du coronavirus, et ces prions peuvent désordonner plutôt des protéines naturelles du cerveau pour les modifier et en faire des prions.
Quand on regarde les courbes de l'OMS, depuis qu'on a vacciné en janvier, les courbes de contamination explosent, et également le nombre de morts, notamment des jeunes, avec de thromboses, tout ça. Oui. Quel est votre regard sur cette vaccination massive, puisqu'on est dans une vaccination massive, alors qu'il y aurait des traitements qui marchent, qui fonctionnent et pas chers?
C'est une énorme erreur, n'est-ce pas? C'est une erreur scientifique et une faute médicale, si on peut dire. Enfin, c'est inacceptable dans l'histoire. On en fera le bilan un jour de tout ça, n'est-ce pas? Car c'est effectivement la vaccination qui a créé les variants. Le virus de Chine, n'est-ce pas, un vaccin, c'est-à-dire des anticorps produits par un vaccin. Et qu'est-ce qu'il va faire le virus? Ou bien mourir, ou bien trouver une solution. Les nouveaux variants sont vraiment la production, la résultante des vaccinations. Et donc vous voyez toujours dans les pays, même pour là maintenant, c'est pareil, vous avez la courbe des vaccinations et la courbe des morts maintenant qui suit. Je suis de près, si vous voulez, des expériences qui sont faites in situ, c'est-à-dire sur des patients, des malades, qui sont devenus infectés par le corona après une vaccination. Hein? Et je veux vous montrer que ce qui est apparu, c'est un virus variant qui résiste à la vaccination.
Comment peut-on vacciner en période épidémique? Expliquez-moi.
C'est impensable. Le silence, si vous voulez, beaucoup de gens savent ça. Les épidémiologistes le savent, tout ça. Ce sont des anticorps produits par le virus qui permettent à l'infection d'être plus forte. Vous voyez? C'est ce qu'on appelle les antibody depending enhancement, c'est-à-dire des anticorps qui favorisent une infection. L'anticorps va se fixer sur le virus et à ce moment-là, il y a des récepteurs aux anticorps que nous avons dans nos macrophages, etc., qui vont à ce moment-là piquer le virus, pas par hasard, mais enfin du fait même qu'il est lié à des anticorps. Vous voyez? Il est clair que les nouveaux variants sont créés par la sélection des anticorps produits par la vaccination.
I think we are in a situation here with this current variant where herd immunity is not a possibility because it still infects vaccinated individuals. And I suspect that what the virus will throw out next is a variant which is perhaps even better at transmitting in vaccinated populations. And so that's even more of a reason not to be making a vaccine program around herd immunity. I don't think there's anything the UK can do to stop the emergence of new variants. They're going to happen. And if anything, we need to focus now not on what might stop new variants, because I don't think we have any facility to control that. We need to focus on thinking about how do we prevent people dying or going to hospital.
When societies lose their liberty, it is because liberty has been crushed under the boot of some tyrant. It's usually because they've been frightened into giving it up voluntarily. And some members of SAGE have made public statements since then saying that this was perhaps overdone, but it was a matter of deliberate policy. In this case, fear is the number one instrument of every despot. So the logic of these extreme measures was always to use fear as an instrument.
I don't think they should be forced to on the understanding, simply because this vaccine does not prevent transmission. So if you just think of the logic of it, what is the point of requiring a vaccine to protect others if that vaccine does not durably prevent onward transmission of a virus? So, I mean, obviously there are all sorts of ethical and political issues surrounding this, but we can peel it right back to the logic. And the logic is simply not there. It's illogical to foist a vaccine upon people in the hope that you can reduce the transmission.
Who have planned this? It's all planned. Now, why they planned this, I don't know. And I don't even think I want to know.
German virologist Dr. Sukharat Buktai had this to say about the vaccines and the virus outbreaks.
What's the level of certainty over the current vaccines?
Well, this is not my view. It's a fact that virtually nothing is known that should be known about these vaccines. Starting from the very beginning, the animal models and where is the gene expressed in the cell, what is the half-life, what is the immunological response of the animal to the gene product, to the spike. Nothing has been looked at. And therefore, in fact, these vaccines haven't been investigated at all. Where do these genes go after intramuscular application? Many people are mistaken when they think that it stays in the muscle. In fact, it's known that the vaccines all go to the lymph nodes and from there to the blood. But it's never been revealed that there are no numbers to tell us. So all of this is really criminal. The virus sticks mainly to the lung. Antibodies in the blood are not going to protect against anything.
Yeah.
They can't.
Yeah. Well, let's come back a little bit at the end also to try and work out why there's been this myopic, I guess it's fair to call myopic focus on vaccines. We can try and speculate maybe a little bit why that happened. And then just going a little bit into the next piece is there's the picture, and I think you very early on, you raised a number of concerns with the regulator, and I've basically split those into two things, the sort of near-term issues that you had with the cerebral venous sinus thrombosis plus clotting. You raised those straight away. And, you know, I just wanted to ask you, you know, we've seen the adverse reaction reports now. I mean, do you feel you were right, basically? So I think the sort of rule of thumb number is about 7 adverse reactions per 1,000 shots. So
I don't know whether I should be feeling this. I think that others should be feeling this, all right? Because we said this many months ago, half a year ago. Anyone who's learned his medicine and biology and immunology would have to have anticipated the same. And I'm aghast that my own colleagues, medics and scientists, didn't appear to think that what was so obvious was going to take place. Because, you know, it all started with the knowledge that we have reactive lymphocytes against this virus, against the spike. This has been known now for 9 months, all right. 11 months, my God. 11 months ago, these papers were published that everyone who's running around here, virtually everyone, has reactive lymphocytes that recognize the so-called new virus, because it's not really new, it's related to other coronaviruses, and our immune system, the lymphocyte, has a memory, and it recognizes the bits and pieces of the spike, which look like the bits and pieces of the other spike. So what must be predicted to happen is that the moment this spike is being produced anywhere in the body, those lymphocytes are going to recognize that the cells are producing the spike, and they are going to attack them. So producing the spikes anywhere near the lymphocytes is going to be damn dangerous, all right? Now, the second thing that we asked, because it was so clear that this had to happen, was once these packages, these genes, entered the bloodstream, where were they going to go? And so if you delve into the literature, you'll see, oh, they go to the liver, they go to the spleen. But wait a moment. What's the liver and what's the spleen? All right. The liver is composed of liver cells, and you have the blood vessels going through the liver. Okay. Same with every other organ. So in fact, the question was, once in the circulation in the vessel, can those genes ever leave the vessel to enter into the liver cells? And the simple answer is no, because they are too big to leave the vessels. And this is something that is so trivial that it is amazing that people don't think about it. The genes are entrapped in your vessel wall. What are the cells then that will take them up? And the answer is the cells that line the vessel wall, because those are the cells they contact. So it's like the tapestry on the walls, you know, those cells are the tapestry, and they take up the genes, and when they then start to produce those spikes, then they become the targets for the lymphocytes to attack. And that, of course, is dangerous, because when you start scratching your tapestry, that is where blood will clot. This is what everyone learns in medicine. You don't go around scratching the vessels of your wall from the inside or the outside. If you start scraping your skin, then the blood will clot. Okay, that's what the clotting system is there for, to stop the blood flowing out. In this case, the blood will not flow out, so it will clot in your vessels. This is always a life-threatening event. Because depending on where the blood clots, you can have a few symptoms, or you can have more symptoms, or you can have terrible symptoms. Now, when we predicted that the blood clots were going to form as a major adverse event, we didn't really know where this was going to happen because, as I told you, this experiment is being done in humans. It's never been done in animals. Those guys who developed these vaccines never took the trouble to look. And this is what is so criminal about the whole thing. And those authorities who okayed this and approved of it, the European Union, all the governments who approved these vaccines, I think they all should be taken to court, because they approved of it for emergency use, where there was no emergency, and where they should have known, and we point out this to the EMA, that it had never been excluded that clots could form, because there were never animal models that would test this. So we're looking at a whole, it's just a horror story. It's a horror story. Millions of human beings. It's the greatest experiment that has ever been performed in the history of medicine, and it's being performed on human beings. It's just an incredible thought.
I'm going to focus my remarks today on the elephant in the room that nobody likes to talk about, that the vaccines kill more people than they save. Today we focus almost exclusively on COVID death saves and vaccine efficacy because we were led to believe that the vaccines are perfectly safe. But this is simply not true. For example, there were 4 times as many heart attacks in the treatment group in the Pfizer 6-month trial report. That wasn't bad luck. Theirs shows heart attacks happen 71 times more often following these vaccines compared to any other vaccine. In all, 20 people died who got the drug, 14 died who got the placebo. Few people notice that. If the net all-cause mortality from the vaccines is negative, vaccines, boosters, and mandates are all nonsensical. This is the case today. Only the VAERS numbers are statistically significant, but the other numbers are troubling. Even if the vaccines had 100% protection, it still means we kill 2 people to save 1 life. 4 experts did analyses using completely different non-US data sources, and all of them came up with approximately the same number of excess vaccine-related deaths, about 411 deaths per million doses. That translates into 150,000 people have died. Now, the real numbers confirm that we kill more than we save. In the most optimistic scenario, it means that 50% of the vaccinated people died and 0% of unvaccinated people died. Unless you can explain that to the American public, you cannot approve the boosters. The paper just posted yesterday on medRxiv entitled mRNA COVID-19 Vaccination and Development of CMR Confirmed Myopericarditis shows that the myopericarditis risk was 1 in 1,000. And that's an overall age range from 18 to 65, mean age of 33. It is not inconsistent with what the VAERS shows. It's pretty clear that the Pfizer trial results were gained. It's statistically impossible for protocol violations to be 5 times higher in the treatment group. Why hasn't this been investigated? Maddie DeGray was 12 when she enrolled in the Pfizer phase 3 trial for kids. Now she's paralyzed for life. It wasn't reported in the Pfizer results. I told Janet Woodcock there was no investigation. Please tell us why this fraud was not investigated.
The Great Barrington Declaration was signed and developed by prize-winning epidemiologists and immunologists as a declaration to oppose these government policies.
We've got to the point where scientists such as yourselves need to kind of gather for secret meetings in houses to come out with declarations of dissent.
Are you of the same opinion?
I don't think I can answer that question.
Why not?
Anyone who speaks out against this line of policy is shut down.
Dr. Peter McCullough had this to say about vaccines and first response treatments.
Frontline Critical Care Consortium, FLCCC, was led by Pierre Corey. I identified him and Dr. Paul Merrick. I communicated with him. We had teleconferences, and I recommended Dr. Corey testify at the second U.S. Senate hearings in December. Also, Dr. J.J. Roster from Florida. Dr. Roster had tried ivermectin in all of his sick patients in Florida hospitals and was enormously successful in reducing mortality. Published his paper in Chest, one of the best pulmonary journals. So I give him tremendous credit for that. And so Dr. Corey and Dr. Roster presented what became a very compelling case for ivermectin. If people were sufficiently turned off by hydroxychloroquine, we could focus on ivermectin. Dr. Tess Lawrie, who's considered one of the world's most prominent analysts in the UK, published, and Dr. Andrew Hill as well, published incredible analyses demonstrating that ivermectin reduced mortality inpatient and outpatient. So a little different than hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine takes a little time to work and probably doesn't work at the very end of the illness, but ivermectin miraculously worked through the range of illness. And so the data started coming on for ivermectin, and there was enough push power for emphasis on the National Institutes of Health guidelines where they made a specific statement regarding ivermectin. They said, you know what, we understand the data with ivermectin. We can't be for it and we can't be against it. It's the same statement that they made for the emergency use Regeneron and Lilly antibodies. The NIH said, we understand the data, we can't be for it or against it. But at least we got a neutral statement out of them. Hydroxychloroquine still to this day has a series of negative statements on this. And doctors, courageous doctors saving the world. So now we have the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons. We have FLCC in the United States. We have 250 treating doctors. We have 4 national telemedicine services, 15 regional telemedicine services. We're treating 10 to 15,000 patients a day. Forget the U.S. government. Forget what anybody says about this. Americans are getting treatment. That once our message on early treatment came with 2 U.S. Senate hearings headed by Senator Ron Johnson, the hospitals started clearing out in the end of December, early January, because early treatment markedly reduces spread and dramatically reduces hospitalization and death. It's the only thing that does that. The hospital doesn't save all the patients. I'd say the hospital honestly has a very modest impact on anything with COVID-19. It's all about early treatment. The hospital started clearing out. The curves came way down in the United States. That's before anybody was fully vaccinated. And I testified in the Texas Senate on March 10th. I said, listen, by standard CDC equations, we're at herd immunity. By March 10th, no vaccine effect. That's actually just treating patients. In Texas, we had 35 treatment centers. Our protocols and methods work. And I have learned over time there are so many ways to treat the virus. I've had a seminar with Dr. Sankaran Chetty in South Africa. He said that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, just like in the United States, had become so politically charged, doctors were losing their license. In fact, some doctors were jailed in trying to help patients with COVID-19. He gave up on them. He's treated 4,000 patients. Fewer than 10% got hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin. He treats them. He times the illness. He waits to day 8, and then he starts inhaled and oral steroids. He starts aspirin, other anti-inflammatories, montelukast, and the high-risk patients he uses anticoagulants on the back end. And he's saved virtually everyone outside of a handful of patients out of 4,000 sick patients in South Africa. So what I've learned about this virus is that if doctors do anything to try to help patients, they can reduce hospitalizations and death. And the only reason why this is such a horrible thing in American history is because doctors failed to act. Don't do it. We were getting official messages that basically said, don't take care of COVID-19. These are codified in policies and emails by major medical organizations. And it went counter. Can you imagine getting an email saying, don't treat pneumococcal pneumonia, just let them die. Don't treat meningitis, let them die. We've never seen this. The term that applies to what's going on is wrongdoing by those in positions of authority. It's called malfeasance. We don't put down a chilling negative message that's going to result in harm. We don't do that. We don't do that in a civil society. It happened from the NIH, the CDC, the FDA, major medical groups, these chilling messages. But at the same time, you had AAPS saying, no, this is wrong, treat patients. You had FLCC, a group that became very strong, saying, no, treat patients. In the UK, we had the BIRD group that said, you know what, treat patients, use ivermectin-based protocols. We had PANDA develop in South Africa. We had the COVID Medical Network develop in Australia. We had treatment domiciliary develop in Italy. So listen, the counter argument to this of no, we should treat the virus, that counterweight was there. And it's one of the reasons why you're talking to me today. You're not talking to some FDA official who basically wanted to throw cold water on things. You're talking to me today because you're getting a sense of truth. You're getting a sense of reality, that this virus is treatable. Everything that we've done for this virus, we've made it far worse by not treating it, keeping patients in fear, isolation. We've done multiple things that have promoted hospitalization, and we've done multiple things that have actually promoted excess mortality. And it's a shameful time in America and in the world.
A couple years ago, if you would have told me that doctors would be verbally wishing their patients died based on their vaccination status or a choice they made, I wouldn't have believed you. If you would have told me that nurses would no longer be advocating for their patients' rights and autonomy, I wouldn't have believed you. If you would have told me that it would be normal to hear people wish other people would die based on a health choice they made, I wouldn't have believed you. And quite frankly, I don't think I would be in the spot I am in life or pursuing the career I am. I don't think that I would hear peers say they wish all unvaccinated people would die. No, I don't think I would have believed you. And I'm just so disgusted by the state of the world right now. I'm sorry, but do we turn people away with kidney failure because they decided to drink one too many and say sucks for you? Or do we put them on dialysis? Do we look at people dying from lung cancer and say, dug your grave, sucks, not helping you? No. Or how about obese people? Do we say, hit the treadmill, fatty, there's nothing I can do for you? No, we don't do that because that's disgusting. And it's wrong. No. As healthcare workers, we do not, as a decent human being, we do not wish other people die. We don't do that. That's not how we roll around here, okay? I'm sorry, but I am so bothered at the fact that that's normal. That it's normal for me to sit and have a conversation with somebody my age and them tell me they hope I die because I'm not vaccinated. No. That's not okay.
And over the next 24 hours, she developed severe abdominal and chest pain. And the way she described the chest pain, and I quote, "It feels like my heart is being ripped out through my neck." She had painful electrical shocks down her neck and spine that forced her to walk hunched over. She had extreme pain in her fingers and toes. It actually made them turn white, and they were cold whenever you touched them. She had edema. So my husband immediately took her to the ER as instructed by the vaccine trial nurse administrator, which is what we were instructed to do. Her blood was taken for a renal profile and tested. She was checked for appendicitis, which she did not have, and given an IV with some medicine, then sent home. However, in the discharge papers from the Children's Hospital ER that she went to, the diagnosis stated adverse effect of vaccine initial encounter. This would be the only time that that was written in her medical charts, but it's in there. Over the next 2.5 months, her abdominal, muscle, and nerve pain became unbearable. She had developed additional symptoms that included gastroparesis, nausea and vomiting, erratic blood pressure and heart rate, memory loss. She mixes up words, brain fog, headaches, dizziness, fainting. She fell and hit her head, and then seizures. She developed verbal and motor tics. She had loss of feeling from the waist down and muscle weakness. Drastic changes in her vision, urinary retention and loss of bladder control, severely irregular and heavy menstrual cycles, and eventually she had to have an NG tube put in to get nutrition. All of these symptoms are still here today. Some days are worse than others. Our greatest challenge came when her doctors began to consider an alternative diagnosis. Well, she really didn't have one before, so it was the first one. So, like everybody else, she had lots of tests, but not nearly as many tests as everybody else, and she's a child. Why didn't they do all those tests on her? Sorry. So, because they couldn't figure it out, one physician labeled her as having functional neurologic disorder, saying it was due to anxiety. This concerned us, and we didn't agree with it because she doesn't have the anxiety. Look at her. I mean, what 13-year-old can sit here calmly, okay, if they have anxiety or mental issues? At one point, they even tried to admit her to a mental hospital.
My employer has just mandated that I must get a vaccine for COVID-19. If I want to keep working at my job as a professor, I have to take this vaccine. Here's my conundrum. My school employs me to be an authority on the subject of ethics. I hold a PhD in ethics and ancient philosophy. And I'm here to tell you it's ethically wrong to coerce someone to take a vaccine. If it happens to you, you don't have to do it. If you don't want a COVID vaccine, don't take one. End of discussion. It's your own business. But that is not the approach of the University of Western Ontario, which has suddenly required that I be vaccinated immediately or not report for work. So with the school year beginning in a few days, I am facing imminent dismissal after 20 years on the job, because I will not submit to having an experimental vaccine injected into my body. I've had plenty of vaccines in my life, but I've never been forced to take one. It's always been my choice. I don't work in a high-risk environment. I'm not a doctor in an emergency room. I'm a teacher. I'm a university professor. My job is to teach students how to think critically, to ask questions that might expose a false argument. Questions like, says who? Who is the authority giving this order? Should I trust them with control over my body? As a professor, I don't have to watch the news to find out if the COVID vaccines are safe. I read medical journals, and I consult my colleagues who are professors of science and medicine. I've learned from doctors that there are serious questions about how safe these vaccines really are. There are questions about how well they work. Nobody's promising that I won't get COVID or transmit COVID if I get the vaccine. But ultimately, none of that matters to me, because I'm a professor of ethics and I'm a Canadian. I'm entitled to make choices about what does and does not enter my body, regardless of my reasons. If I'm allowed back into my university, it's my job to teach my students that this is wrong. I'm hired to teach them that it is ethically wrong to impose an experimental medical procedure as a condition of employment. This is my first and potentially my last lesson of the year. Ethics 101. In the spirit of Socrates, who was executed for asking questions, this lesson will consist of only one question. The answer is multiple choice. Please listen carefully. When a person has done the same job to the satisfaction of her employer for 20 years, is it right Or is it wrong to suddenly demand that they submit to an unnecessary medical procedure in order to keep their job? In this case, the procedure is an injection of a substance that has not been fully tested for safety. It has not yet been shown to be effective. It is designed to prevent an illness that poses little threat to the employee. The employee is not allowed to ask questions. She may only submit to the procedure or be fired. To my first-year students, is this right?
So, if the leading experts are not only questioning these guidelines and political policies, but are actually opposing them and calling for immediate suspension of the EUA emergency vaccination programs, then what exactly are we considering to be science these days? If you are unsure, does that not at least owe a moment of your time to look at the alternative points of view from the expert scientists who are being censored by YouTube and social media?
I mean, I couldn't even imagine how heartbreaking and excruciatingly painful it would be to have to say goodbye to a loved one, you know, to say goodbye to your mom, or to have to say goodbye to your dad, or if you're a parent and you've got a sick child. You know, we have a Phoenix Children's Hospital here in Phoenix, one of the biggest children's hospitals in the country, and sadly, you know, kids, you know, pass away sometimes, and to not allow these moms and dads in to be with their dying kids, to not allow family members to come in and to hold their parents' hand that one final time, you know, to give dad a kiss on the forehead, you know, or to hug your mom one final time, you know, before she passes away. Like, that to me is literally the most inhumane aspect of this entire COVID situation. And with the fact that we've had so many people now that have literally had to die alone. We've had so many family members that have had to say goodbye to their loved ones over FaceTime because the hospitals were refusing to let family members inside. Meanwhile, their family members literally on their deathbed, waiting to take their last breath, and we're keeping people, you know, outside for those last crucial moments of life that people will never get back. I can't think of anything more inhumane to be done to not only a patient, but to a patient's family.
This is where Britain's youngest person with coronavirus died yesterday. 13-year-old Ismail Mohammed Abdul Wahab from Brixton was being treated at King's College Hospital in London. His family were unable to visit him, and friends are tonight paying tribute.
The tragic thing was that we couldn't go visit, that she had to die alone in a hospital.
Couldn't touch her. I couldn't say goodbye. I had to see her through a window.
Hang on a minute, don't take her away. Hey, don't take her away. Don't take her away. Don't take her away, you bastards. You absolute bastards. Oh, God.
It's not even something you can fathom. I mean, you just think, oh, you know, when it gets close to the end, they'll let someone in. Like, they have to let someone in. People can't possibly do this by themselves. People can't die alone.
Despite being a nurse here at UMass herself, Casey says this window replaced what would be a bedside moment of the most intimate of human experiences.
Beth says Diane started pleading with anyone she could at the hospital last Friday to allow her to go. For 3 days, the answer remained no. Then the call came overnight on Sunday. Jim had passed.
And after all that time, they said, but you can come now. You know, we were like, you can come now?
6 feet separated them, but it might as well have been a mile.
Girls, they can't get close, okay?
This separation does not come naturally. Rose and Vincent Randazzo had been married 69 years, inseparable, until COVID visitor restrictions in March ended Vince's visits to see his Rose at Edna Tina Nursing Home.
Hey, come here. Just come here.
I can't. She's very strong.
Can't come here.
Held out her hands, and it was just an automatic reaction to just hug her, you know.
But COVID protocol prevented person-to-person contact. Chelsea and her grandfather mandated to stand several feet away.
To not be able to hug her and embrace her, and just have her cry out for me, it was heart-wrenching.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay. Rose, they can't get close, okay?
Now 91 years old and drastically deteriorating in health, Rose does not understand why she cannot hug her family.
Please, get over here.
I can't get closer. I can't, look, see the marks here?
Yeah.
Yeah, the aide threatened to take her back to her room if she wouldn't stop.
These guidelines are terrible. She can stand there and touch my grandma, but I can't give her a hug. Then give me a shield.
I can't do that.
Then give me a shield or gloves.
Cancel this visit. I'm going to be honest with you. I will cancel this visit.
Then you're a cruel human being if you do that.
But I'm sorry.
I haven't seen her in 7 months.
But I'm sorry. I have rules that I have to go by. They have to go back. They have to go back. They have to go back. No, they cannot be near.
Chelsea's grandmother notices that a new baby is on the way.
I was waiting to tell her in person about my pregnancy, and I was about 7 months along.
Chelsea's gonna have another baby, so I can't come over.
I can't.
She can't. She can't, right? Not now.
You know, when I had my first son, she would touch my belly and talk to the baby, and that's what I wanted.
But that never happens. In fact, Chelsea would only see her grandma in person one more time. Rose Violet passed away on December 8th.
And I didn't get to hold her again, or kiss her, or touch her.
We have to do social distance. I'm sorry, bro.
This obviously happened to, I believe, millions of our most vulnerable, and we sat by and watched it happen. We stood outside the windows. We joined them by Zoom. They died alone, and it is a travesty. I believe it's a criminal actions in a lot of cases. I believe that it needs to be exposed on a grander scale than it has been, and we need to take personal responsibility for stopping this, because we're now almost a year in, and some people to this day have not been able to be with their loved ones. It is our responsibility, and it always been in history, to take care of the widows, to take care of those that were and set the examples for us. They are the people who defended the rights and liberties that we're here trying to protect today. They're the people that served in the wars. They went through the Depression. They went through all of the things that we went through in their lifetimes. And it's our obligation to protect them, to love them, to care for them, and the majority of them should have a free right and choice to say, I choose, if I get this virus and die, I would be happier if I'm with my family than I would to be isolated and say that I was to stay virus-free.
When someone tests positive for coronavirus when they're in hospice or when they're in the nursing home, the first process that happens is they're removed from whatever room they were in. Often they share that room with multiple other people that they think of as their neighbors, people that they spend years with, and they're taken and placed into a room where there's no one else there. They have limited interaction with nursing staff because they're on quarantine, and they have no interaction with their families. As a result, they're often very depressed. By the end of it, they feel very alone. They often stay in this isolation for upwards to 4 weeks because they need a series of negative tests before they're allowed to return to their previous rooms. And when the staff go into the room, they usually have multiple masks on, face shield on. These people are very often hard of hearing, and they have to see your mouth. It's so often this happens, they cannot understand you without seeing your mouth. And so when there's all these masks and barriers between the nurses and the patients, even though they're going in there, they're offering very little companionship because the patients don't even understand what they're trying to say. So they have very little conversation. There's usually not even televisions. I mean, a lot of people might think that every person has a television in these nursing homes, but televisions are not very common. I think they're usually personal possessions, and nobody is allowed to bring their personal possessions when they're placed in quarantine. Anything they want to retain and take back to their previous room has to stay in the previous room. It cannot go into quarantine with them. So books, crossword puzzles, television, none of that is permitted in quarantine. And so there's no form of escape and there's no interaction.
So my wife's grandfather had a heart attack, went into the hospital, tested negative, then tested positive, then they put him in a COVID ward, and then he ended up dying alone in a cold hospital bed, not surrounded by family, by himself. His wife of, I think, over 75 years is still alive, but she has been in another facility ever since October. So do you imagine being married to your soulmate for over 75 years and for the last 3 months of your life being separated and then dying alone in a hospital bed? I couldn't imagine any of that. And I guarantee you this, and I can't ask him this question, but I know what I would want. If I would have went up to him and said, hey, Jaju, you have a choice right now. Would you rather die several years ago, be surrounded by family and loved ones, or would you rather die like you did? I know my answer. I would rather die several years before and be around family and not die alone.
You know, my mother died in October, and she had been kept from her kids, grandkids, great-grandkids for 7 months and then died. And I have photos from her of her a year before she passed away, and they were pictures of my son has a lot of children. She was holding a little infant in her arms, and she was just so happy. And her assisted living facility in Chicago robbed her of her greatest joy. I would say probably the majority of people in these nursing homes in assisted living, they live for the hugs, the touch, the facial recognition of their family members. That's the high point of their day or their week or their month. That's what they live for. That's what my mom lived for. And I have a patient who she's 91. She's in assisted living. When the lockdown happened, she had a very devoted daughter who used to come every day. And when they shut her off, that daughter off, within 2 days, my 91-year-old patient stopped communicating. Before she was a pretty feisty, fun, person. She completely stopped communicating. She didn't make, she'd stop making eye contact. She stopped talking. And then eventually she stopped eating, and eventually she stopped drinking fluids, and she died, in my opinion, from the isolation of COVID. And there are many, many of those kind of cases across the country. And the other bizarre thing that 91-year-old was robbed of is that when they finally decided that her family members could come see her, because we knew she was going to die within a day or two, the daughter was allowed to come in. The son from out of state was allowed to come in, but the daughter and son could only go in that room if they were gowned, gloved, and masked. And this woman, this 91-year-old woman who died in that room, she was in a room by herself, and the brother and sister could not go in together. And so those last moments of touch and facial recognition and hugs, or even a clear voice that's not speaking through a mask, my patient was robbed of that. And this is being played out by I don't know how many senior citizens across the country. So, and I think if that woman, and if my mother had the option, if they had been told that you can take, there's a virus out there, it's really scary, it's killing people, you could take a chance with that virus, you're going to be risking that dangerous virus. Do you want to see your family members and take that risk? My mother would have said, of course, I want to see my family. I need to see my family. My brother, my beloved older brother, lives in Chicago. My mother would say to him, almost every time they talk, it's like, I have 7 children. Why aren't you coming to visit me? She'd say, John, why can't you just sneak up the back door and get me out of here? So, anyway. So they're saying that they care so much about the elderly, and that's why they're doing this to them. It's not true. Yes, elderly people, they're more prone to get viruses, bacteria, other infections. Of course, as we get older, we deteriorate. We all know about that. But they're also more prone to loneliness and despair. Old people, this is, like I said, this is what they live for. And so initially with this, I really thought the nursing home administrators meant well and that they were misguided, but they meant well. That's what I thought a while back. But then in June, I started reading the details of CARES Act 2020 and found out that $4.9 billion of CARES Act 2020 money went to these nursing homes and assisted living. So they're being paid. They're being paid money to torment these elderly people. They're getting paid for that. So there is no good intention there. And then if you add on top of that, the nursing homes and the assisted living facilities are testing their employees once or twice a week. That adds up to they're making bank off of this and torturing these people. So no, I don't believe for a minute that they care, that they're doing this because they care about the elderly.
Vaccine was 94.5% effective.
The so-called 95% efficiency rate touted by the pharmaceutical companies was misleading, to say the least. A peer-reviewed study by The Lancet confirms the vaccine efficiency of 95% reported by the vaccine manufacturers was referring to relative risk reduction, rather than absolute risk reduction, as would be standard. Your actual risk of reduction of getting COVID after the vaccine has then been reduced by 1.2% with Moderna, 1.2% with Johnson & Johnson, and by less than 1% with Pfizer. Meaning after you receive the vaccine, on average, you are 99% just as likely to get COVID.
So now we have two vaccines that are really quite effective. The mRNA vaccine, highly effective, extraordinarily efficacious, 94 to 95% for mild to moderate disease, and virtually 100% efficacious, because the real world effectiveness is even more impressive than the results of the clinical trial. Shot. We've got to make sure we clarify that with people. It has nothing to do whether or not it's effective. We know it's highly effective. Highly effective.
I briefly worked with the UK Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, when he was, as I was, researchers in the Wellcome Research Labs in about late 1980s. I know who he is, he knows who I am, but they leave me alone because I'm ineffective. If I become effective, that would be different. But I think they're not worried because they have complete control of the mass media, TV, radio, newspapers, internet. And the only people who will see me are really people already looking for information. So I doubt I'll convert very many people, because people who need to be converted are not looking. They're looking at main media, and that message is completely controlled and hermetically sealed. So if we carry on doing the same things, we're just playing out our expected role in a simulation that whoever's running this has already thought about.
First one, a study done by Yale University about COVID-19 vaccine messaging.
These messages were given to unvaccinated individuals to see if it would increase their willingness to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Here are some of the messages about getting your personal freedom back, economic freedom. It's in your best self-interest and your community's interest, but this one here, these last few are my personal favorite. Social experiments, social pressure experiments. Let's read. This message is about the danger the COVID-19 presents to the health of one's family and community. The best way to protect them is by getting vaccinated, and society must work together to get enough people vaccinated. Then it asks the participant to imagine the guilt that they will feel if they do not get vaccinated and spread disease. This message goes on for embarrassment and anger, asking the participant to imagine those emotions if they don't get the vaccine and spread disease, which is silly because you can still spread it if you're vaccinated, but I digress. These last two are my personal favorites. They're just the cherry on top here. Let's read. This message is about how getting vaccinated against COVID-19 is the most effective way at protecting one's community. Vaccination is backed by science. If one does not get vaccinated, that means that one does not understand how infections are spread and who ignores science. Bravery message. This message, which describes how firefighters, doctors, and frontline medical workers are brave, and those who choose not to get vaccinated against COVID-19 are not brave. A lot of gaslighting and manipulation, if you ask me. Here's another one, pushing messages to minority populations by Mayo Clinic. Another one directed to Black and Brown communities. Another one giving healthcare workers the proper communication to push COVID vaccine. Some financial incentives based on race and gender. More incentives. More behavioral studies about increasing vaccination acceptance. Another study targeted toward American Indian tribal communities to protect your elders. Some more behavioral studies. Here's the Pfizer vaccine effectiveness study. Safety of administering a second dose of COVID mRNA with people who had allergies. Newsflash, it's not good. No prevention of COVID-19 for healthcare workers. Let's see. There is no proven vaccine available to protect healthcare workers against COVID. Impact on fertility study. Ooh, let's check this one out. Medical herbs can mediate the immunity disorder caused by infections and mutated cells, including COVID-19.
The biggest problems with the Delta variant, as you well know, is that even for vaccinated people, we now know you can get a breakthrough infection and you could be spreading it even if you don't feel sick and you have no symptoms, which is one reason we've had this explosive growth in COVID cases this summer. So here's my question. Is there hope, or better yet, data, that getting this third booster shot could actually prevent transmission?
So there's actually hope. We don't have data yet. We do know that the higher levels of protection, certainly in the Alpha variant, result.
This proves that it does protect the community. So how are we to reconcile what you've just told me and what we're being told all the time, which is the vaccines do prevent transmission, or they're not sterilizing, but they do lessen transmission?
No, so I think and again, it all comes down to mathematics. If you're happy to go through a mathematics lesson, so it all comes down to the R0, the transmissibility of a virus.
Right.
And so if we have a virus that has an R0 that's just above 1, so then we know that all we need to do is get the R0 below 1, and the virus will die out. Right, because it means that you have to have at least one person infected by each person who's infected for the virus to keep propagating.
Yes.
So certainly if COVID had an R0 of 1.2 and a vaccine even had a slightest impact on the risk of transmission, right, which there is evidence that there's a very weak effect on transmission, then in fact, yes, it could have an impact. The problem we're dealing with is that Delta has an R0 that's somewhere between 6 and 8.
Wow.
So for every person infected, right, they're going to infect 6 to 8 other people. So a vaccine that reduces the transmissibility of the virus by, say, 20% is going to take that, R0 of 6 and it may get it down to 5. So now instead of a person infecting 6 people, they're going to infect 5 people. Well, exponential growth where each person's infecting 5 people is going to look no different to if they were infecting 6 people. So, so that's why it becomes a fallacy when you deal with a specific problem such as the Delta variant.
Right. Okay, I have gotten a great education from your LinkedIn profile. Thank you for being active on LinkedIn. I encourage everyone to follow the professor. I'll put his LinkedIn profile below. You've said something similar in some of your posts where you said, for example, I am a vaccine developer who's strongly against vaccine mandates. I don't believe I'm the only one in this position because, ironically, it is those who know the least about vaccine science who are most vocal supporters of mandates, claiming they will allow life to get back to normal, but they won't. So this is a big claim because we've been told they'll get us back to normal. You're saying they won't because they don't provide sterilizing immunity?
That's right. So we know in countries that are way ahead of Australia, you know, that have 90% vaccination coverage, they're still having major outbreaks. The minute that they remove social isolation, they remove masks, you know, they try to go back to normal. They've been hit with major waves of disease. Their hospitals are filled up. They start to see deaths again. So, you know, again, it's not that Australia are discovering this sort of somehow we're unique to the rest of the world. Other countries are already there. And what they've realised is, even with exceptionally high vaccination rates, vaccination by itself will not be enough to make life go back to normal. And it's just an unfortunate fact. Now, if we have more effective vaccines, and of course, we, for one, are trying to develop a more effective vaccine, maybe vaccines would allow us to go back to normal. But I'm talking about the existing vaccines and what we know about the existing vaccines, which is that they don't give complete protection. The other major issue that isn't discussed is just how fast the protection wears off. We now recognise, you know, from data with the mRNA vaccines, which have been used exclusively in Israel, we have very nice data showing after 4 months that any protection against actual infection is all gone. 4 months after having your 2 doses, which is why in Israel they've now given everyone a 3rd dose. Is that going to be enough? Well, it's too early to tell. But, you know, that's extremely rapidly waning immunity. And that means those people 4 months after having had their mRNA vaccines, you know, there is no effect that we know of on transmissibility, because if their rate of infection now is the same as people who are not vaccinated, and the level of virus when you test them when they're positive is the same as someone who hasn't been vaccinated.
Right.
On what basis are you arguing that in itself is going to allow life to get back to normal? It's not.
In terms of marginalising your work and not allowing others to use their manufacturing facilities and so on, what did you mean by that?
So, you know, I've been very disappointed in CSL because they try to paint themselves as a good corporate citizen in Australia, and yet I think in truth their behaviour belies that. You know, last year we approached the government for support for developing our vaccine. It was the first vaccine in Australia to go into human trials. And so, you know, we thought this is something the Australian government would embrace. The feedback we got was, well, you know, you need to have manufacture the vaccine in Australia, otherwise we're not interested. So we then approached CSL and had a discussion with CSL saying, this is the situation. Here we have, you know, a promising vaccine. It's in the clinic, but the government are not going to support it unless we can access essentially your manufacturing capability, given that most of CSL's manufacturing capability in Australia is paid for by the Australian taxpayer, not by CSL, believe it or not.
Okay.
So all their infrastructure they use to generate their profitable drugs is paid for by the Australian taxpayer.
Right.
So we thought that they would say yes, you know, like everyone else, you know, if you have a good candidate, we'll assist you, and potentially if you have funding, this is not for free. We would be paying for it. We'll give you access to our expertise and our facility. Instead, CSL said, no way, regardless of whether we have capacity or not, we have no interest in helping you. And, that was the end of the discussion.
Why would they be acting this way, in your opinion?
Well, you would have to ask CSL that. I mean, all I can do is repeat what was said, which is we have no interest in helping you. We have no intention to help you. And even if we had capacity, we would not give you access to our facility. I mean, we were stunned, but that was a very senior official speaking on behalf of CSL. And from that point, clearly the Australian government, have not supported us. And we believe that CSL have been actively lobbying the government not to support us, because I guess our assumption is because we potentially could become a competitor to CSL if our vaccine was successful here. And they don't want that to happen. And CSL do have a reputation for being a monopolist. I think the US Monopoly Commission actually did an investigation into CSL many years ago with regard to plasma products, and actually held that they were trying to take a monopolistic position globally on supply of those products. So this would not be the first time CSL have engaged in monopolistic behaviour. So it's all to do with the denominator and how many people you give vaccines to. So when people start dismissing, a vaccine that might cause a death in 1 in 100,000 or 1 in 200,000, under normal circumstances, that vaccine would never be approved.
Wow. And you just said a short time ago about Denmark, some of the official figures, you're talking 1 in 25,000. We're talking about much higher adverse rates.
Well, 1 in 25,000 young women having central venous thrombosis, not necessarily dying from it, because, again, with intensive care treatment, but they may be maimed by it. But yes, I mean, we're talking about a life-threatening side effect in 1 in 25,000 people, which is extremely high, which is why most countries then proceeded to actually ban the use of AstraZeneca in those populations that were at higher risk. And so we saw Scandinavia the first to say we're removing AstraZeneca, from people, say, I think they started under 30 and then it went to under 50, because the risks were perceived as too high relative to the benefit.
Right.
Because it's all a risk-benefit assessment at the end of the day.
Yes.
And so something that in an elderly person where they're at incredibly high risk of dying from COVID,
yes, you
might tolerate, quite a high adverse event profile.
Right.
Because you're balancing that up against, a 20% risk of death if they get COVID, in the over 80s, for instance.
Right.
And so you can justify a very high side effect ratio in that particular aged population.
Yep.
In a young person where their risks of dying from COVID are extremely small, now the risks, the same vaccine, the risks may be unacceptably high relative to the benefit in that particular person. And so that's why each person has to make the decision, not the government, as to whether they want that vaccine, because the risk is not the same for everyone, and the benefit is not the same for everyone.
So what are your views on, they're coming for my kid, I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. They're already pushing it lower and lower and lower. What are your views on vaccinating, like my kids, against COVID, 5 and 3?
So I think the issue is not whether ultimately children shouldn't be vaccinated against COVID, although their risks are very low relative to adults, but still some children, potentially can die just as they do from flu, or get serious illness. But it's a very, very low rate. But if we want to ultimately stop that happening, then definitely at some point in the future, I think we'll get to a situation where it will make sense to immunise young children. The issue is, are we at that point yet? And my answer would be no, mainly because we're using technologies that, as I mentioned, have never been tested in large numbers of humans, outside of the last 12 months. So we don't know ultimately the long-term safety of those products.
So what would the point?
And so would I give an mRNA vaccine or an adenoviral vector vaccine if my children were 10 years old or 5 years old right now? As just absolutely not. I would say the risk, of not knowing what the consequences may be, could it affect their development? Could there be some, long-term issue emerge over the next 5 or 10 years, even if that's 0.01%? For my children, I would say that that's too high a risk. I would like to see the adult data, over 5 years. Now, if the adults who've had it and over 5 years, we don't see any emerging signal of a chronic disease or some disorder that could be attributed to the vaccine, then I think at that stage you would start to say, okay, maybe that, is safe to give to my children. Okay. So that's in respect of the new technologies. Now, obviously, we give our children inactivated flu vaccines, we give them recombinant protein hepatitis B vaccine at birth. Yeah. We know that they're extremely safe technologies. We've been doing it. In fact, we as children had those vaccines, and we're all doing okay. So I think that, when I say I wouldn't give my child one of these new vaccine technologies, not because there is a safety issue, but because we can't be certain about that, would I be more comfortable to give them a vaccine, a COVID vaccine that's based on, recombinant protein or inactivated virus, very similar to what we're doing with flu and hepatitis B? Obviously, my level of comfort would be a lot greater in that context. So it is very much still technology-centric, the question about, how much data do we need before we accept that risk-benefit is sufficient.
The next episode would look at who the people are that have developed these guidelines and what background history they have.
About the vaccine, I came up with the vaccine. They said it would take 3 to 5 years, gonna save the world.
The president has made a decision to suspend all travel to the United Kingdom and Ireland.
Dis and misinformation circulating over the internet.
Across the world, misinformation about the virus is being shared online.
A significant demand for N95 masks and gloves are on the rise.
The demand for N95 masks to prevent the deadly airborne virus has surged.
We could eventually have 52 million treatment courses per year, but it will take many months to get there.
We're still many months out from having something that we can really deploy to the public.
And 65% of those polled are eager to take the vaccine, even if it's experimental.
A new poll finds that 49% of Americans say they would get a COVID-19 vaccine should an effective one be discovered.
I'm curious, who wrote the Event 201 script? If the visionaries of the event knew, at least 1 year in advance, what was needed, why didn't they take care of those things? Considering that Bill Gates has donated half of his fortune to make the world safer, why didn't he help to better prepare our hospitals and frontline workers? Why didn't any of the event's wealthy sponsors do something?
Now here we are. We didn't simulate this. We didn't practice.
On behalf of our partners in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
So both the health policies and economic policies
we find ourselves in uncharted territory.
Event 201 was not the first scripted exercise to prophesize the future with astonishing accuracy. Leaders of global health and business have been seeding reality with fictional scenarios for several decades.
The scenario, obviously, is fictional.
1 year prior to Event 201, many of the same sponsors, hosts, and actors came together to produce a tabletop pandemic simulation for a fictional virus they branded Clade X.
1 year to produce a vaccine for this is too long.
We should have stockpiled, we didn't, but we're going to have to look at that vaccine question to see if we can speed up the delivery.
And if we do not have the public with us, we're in big trouble.
In 2010, the Rockefeller Foundation released a 54-page document called Scenarios for the Future of Technology and International Development. Page 18 features the pandemic scenario, Lockstep, a world of tighter top-down government control and authoritarian leadership, with limited innovation and growing citizen pushback. China's government was not the only one that took extreme measures to protect its citizens from risk and exposure. During the pandemic, national leaders around the world flexed their authority and imposed airtight rules and restrictions, from the mandatory wearing of face masks to body temperature checks at the entries to communal spaces like train stations and supermarkets. Even after the pandemic faded, this more authoritarian control and oversight of citizens and their activities stuck and even intensified.
It's the United Nations in lockstep with the World Economic Forum. In what they are boasting will be the great reset of all our economies and of all our personal liberties.
Now is the historical moment, a time.
This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset.
It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again.
We must not miss this unique window of opportunity.
Reading from the COVID-19 The Great Reset book by Klaus Schwab and his co-author, if no one power can enforce order, our world will suffer from a global order deficit. Think about that, reread that sentence. If no one power can enforce order, our world will suffer from a global order deficit.
In short, we need a great reset.
But how do the World Economic Forum and the United Nations intend to bring about this great reset they keep promising us? Well, they need national and state governments and other bodies to play along. And one of the key tools they are using is a 3-word slogan: Build Back Better.
We will build back better from the COVID crisis.
Build it back better.
To come back stronger and build back better.
Build Canada back better.
Build Back Better has bizarrely been the slogan for all sorts of different political groups around the world. Bill Clinton used it to promote the Clinton Foundation after the Haiti hurricane disaster.
The recent cholera outbreak serves as a stark reminder of the urgency we face to address the strengthened reconstruction efforts in Haiti to help the people build back better.
Haitian activists staged a protest outside Hillary Clinton's Manhattan office. The demonstrators claim billions of dollars were stolen through the Haiti Reconstruction Commission headed by Bill Clinton. They also say Haiti was used as a cover for foreign governments to funnel kickbacks of possibly hundreds of millions of dollars through the Clinton Foundation.
Given that Clinton himself was the one who coined this term, Build Back Better, there's been very little transparency and accountability despite all these buzzwords, sustainable development, community consultation.
Any disaster can be the perfect excuse to build back better by using the money that should be going to disaster relief to instead subsidize the UN agenda at the same time as making renewables investors very rich.
So behind the great Haiti disaster story, that is used to cover up what Big Pharma, Big Oil, Big Bank is actually doing.
The absolute first thing we have to keep in mind with the Great Reset is that this has absolutely nothing to do with any sort of virus or disease or anything of the sort. This is a coordinated agenda that has been years in the making. This isn't meant to end.
I think we're in the middle of a massive experiment worldwide. And that
where
is...
are the guinea pigs?
Maybe. The experiment is, will people listen to scientists?
Trust the science.
Follow the science and follow the evidence. Listen to the experts.
We follow the science.
I trust the science, and I certainly am going to trust those experts.
Trust the science and get on with it.
I trust the scientists.
Follow the science.
The science is evolving, the science is moving, and we are following the science each and every day.